Metroid. It's a game series so prolific that if you Google search Nintendo Holy Trinity, you get this awesome artwork. Its design is so influential that it takes up half of the name of one of gaming's most beloved genres. It's one of the pioneers of all of video games, and since it's been around so long, we've all gotten to grow up with it over the years and create some great gaming memories from it. I've got a particularly fond one myself, which, of all things, came from having my wisdom teeth removed. Knowing I was in for some bloody painful days ahead, I made a point of securing a trip to Blockbuster, back when, existed, so I could treat my predicament with the healing power of video games. Being a completionist, I thought back on the games I had started but never finished, and I ended up choosing Metroid Prime 2 for the Nintendo GameCube.
I remember liking it fine after the first rental, but my appreciation for the world Retro Studios created rose immensely by having more free time for this playthrough. It allowed me to really dive into the depths of Aether, absorb the technical wonder of the Sanctuary Fortress, and feel like the universe's greatest badass when I took out Dark Samus. And then there was the ending itself. I slowly walk away from the Grateful Luminoth, they bow towards me, and what do I respond with? Nothing more than a simple hand wave. As if to say, don't mention it. Happy to help. Their civilization now safe, I left the planet and went flying off for more adventure. So now we all have our own special Metroid moments. This was mine and the one where it finally clicked as a whole for me. I played other better Metroids in the past and I enjoyed them for the well-crafted games they were, but this experience is where I felt like I wasn't just playing as Samus Aran, I was Samus Aran. When that bond was formed and when it was realized, it managed to elevate my respect for the entire series, and made replaying those classics an absolute joy. It quickly became one of my favorite video game franchises, and even lackluster titles like Metroid Prime Hunters couldn't dampen my or the fans' enthusiasm. And then Metroid Other M happened. Boy, did it happen. Well, reviews were at best decent and at worst scathing. Metroid Other M became a popular whipping boy very quickly for many critics, and it didn't fare that much better in the fandom. This isn't to say there aren't very good reasons why this happened. It is an incredibly flawed game, and much of the backlash was well-founded. Yet with all the discussion that game ended up producing, I honestly don't think I like where it ended up.
See, and there's no way to say this without sounding like a smug know-it-all, I don't think that most of them got to the heart of what was really wrong with Metroid Other M, and in the process, they've undermined some of the game's stronger elements. Meanwhile, just treating the game as one grand betrayal sends its own wrong message.
It's not unreasonable to assume that sort of backlash could give Nintendo the impression that taking a risk with an established franchise is unwelcome. And really, the game industry is already filled with AAA companies that play things safe to a fault. So we don't really want to encourage that attitude. With that in mind, I feel it's important to look back and dissect exactly what happened in Other M, and why it felt like they ruined Samus. Because while I'm going to go into great detail about the subtle and not so subtle design choices that I think actually led to this sensation, I'm not going to deny for a moment that the hurt fans felt wasn't real. Like I said, we all have our own special Metroid moments that made us love Samus, and if we're going to claim that Other M broke our collective hearts, we have to get a complete picture of the series' legacy so that backlash can be processed and understood. Now, first things first, I do want to give credit to Nintendo for choosing to make this game in the first place. Despite the company's skill at reinventing themselves, they do have a tendency on relying too much on a formula that works by releasing sequels that don't substantially differ from the original. Additionally, while Metroid is one of Nintendo's most prolific franchises, it doesn't exactly haul cash in the same way as a typical Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon release. It's a pretty big gamble for Nintendo to take one of their star series in a completely different direction. You risk alienating your core fanbase if the changes are too drastic, and if the project doesn't fully succeed, you won't attract new ones either. And the thing is, while this gamble didn't exactly pay off this time, it funnily enough did before with this very franchise. While technically not a reboot due to the shared continuity, Metroid Prime arrived after a 7 to 8 year hiatus and was radically different than anything that came before. It was the first 3D entry, the world and enemies were new, the story had little to do with what came before, and most notably, it looked and played like a first-person shooter. And yet, none of these changes stopped it from collecting several Game of the Year awards and becoming the highest-selling game in the series to date. Clearly, both critics and fans were in solidarity over the game's merit. So, given that it's probably one of the most successful reinterpretations of any game ever, it's a good reference point to show how different eras of Metroid titles can still live up to the series' legacy. Metroid Prime actually starts off eerily similar to the much-lauded Super Metroid. Both start on an orbiting space station, you fight a boss, and then you have to escape before the place self-destructs. They even both have Ridley on board for good measure. Afterwards, you are left alone on a mysterious, treacherous, but approachable alien planet. The level progression of these games is actually quite linear. Accessing each relevant region of the world can only be done by obtaining certain power-ups that tend to be found in a specific order. But the key thing here is the games always leave you free to explore the world's nooks and crannies, even if most of the terrain is currently inaccessible. As you grow stronger, the world opens up more and more, and you're eventually able to traverse nearly everywhere. This allows for the designers to let the player ease into the gigantic world they've created without it ever being too overwhelming or constricting. Furthermore, the power-ups that you do acquire allow you to access optional areas that can contain their own little bonuses, and they reward you for going off the beaten path and being mindful of your surroundings. Finally, though there is an optional hint system in Prime, they offer no guidance beyond that on how to get from point A to point B. They trust that the player will be able to figure out on how to advance by navigating the world, solving its puzzles, because that's the main reason why we're playing it. So this idea of you being all on your own and the onus all being on the player, most games usually use it to prop up a sort of one-man army power fantasy. But the thing that's interesting about Metroid is it uses this idea to communicate what I would argue is its defining theme: isolation. Samus Aran is perhaps one of the loneliest characters in all of gaming. Even before her tragic backstory was revealed in the manga, the premise of the games inferred this sensation. She is an independent bounty hunter operating in the vast emptiness of space. Her line of work is dangerous, scarring, and no doubt hinders her ability to form meaningful human connections. And though she works for the Galactic Federation, she remains an outsider. She explores alien worlds that are unfamiliar and unwelcoming. Whatever familiar settings she finds, be they human or Chozo, she finds are all dead and in ruins. She seldom meets anybody else, and the only creatures that are still alive are all trying to kill her. And the few people she does encounter, they'd routinely send her on solo missions, so the personal contact Samus receives is fleeting. This mood is further accentuated by the gameplay. The music isn't rousing or catchy, but haunting and atmospheric. Combat doesn't invoke high-energy catharsis because most enemies are simple to dispose of and pose no immediate threat. Rather, due to the nature of the health system, the enemies are designed to wear you down over time, as if to suggest that this lifestyle is gradually eating away at her. And yet, in spite all of these setbacks that would break lesser people, Samus thrives. You both learn from your surroundings, gain strength from them, and complete missions that no one else could. This is what makes Samus so absorbing, and why I'd argue she's more than just an all-around badass. And for further proof, it's why the Prime games follow up the final boss fight with a moment where Samus removes her helmet, and to reflect on what's transpired. And the thing is, it's fascinating to consider the mental toll this takes on her, because when you get down to it, we actually don't know anything about what she's thinking. Despite the occasional text prompt that addresses the player, Samus has effectively been a silent protagonist since her debut in 1986. She was far from alone back then, since the limitations in memory space meant games couldn't exactly flesh out both their characters and their gameplay. Even still, the silent protagonist archetype has stuck around thanks to how naturally it allows the player to immerse themselves into the character. I mean, at the beginning I was interchangeably talking about whether it was my experience or Samus's experience, and really it's because it's both of our experiences. So, while I don't think it's completely fair to dismiss her as a mere cipher for the player, I do believe a lot of the overall fondness for Samus Aran does come from that personal connection. In terms of knowing about her personality, there isn't much we can conclusively say. Now, this isn't to say we can't build off the game's themes to come up with plausible readings. I mean, we're never given an explanation on why Samus, after spending a whole game exterminating Metroids, would suddenly spare a newborn hatchling. But if you think about the theme of isolation from before, perhaps we can come up with some readings. Maybe she felt a common bond, as this was the last Metroid and she's the last of her kind and she just felt she couldn't break it. Or, if you consider the manga, maybe she regretted what she had just done because it's similar to what Ridley did to her family when she was a kid. And, since she's well aware that one can still achieve great things despite a lonely upbringing, perhaps she sought to redeem herself by letting that Metroid live. That said, for all her ambiguity, if there is one thing we can say about Samus for certain, it's that both she and the player have done great things. Multiple space pirate factions have been toppled, planets have been saved from certain doom, and an entire race of galaxy-threatening creatures has been exterminated. Point being, since the bulk of her legacy has been defined almost exclusively through the gameplay, it's critical that whatever ongoing narrative elements there are in the games themselves don't distract or contradict from that sensation. With that said, let's actually take a quick moment to talk about how Metroid tells its stories, because on the surface, some of you might be thinking, well, wait, there's nothing going on here. There's no cutscenes, there's no exposition, there's barely any dialogue. How could there be a story going on? Well, instead of being showcased like the typical ongoing narrative that we're used to, it's presented more like a mystery where all the details get filled in gradually by exploring the world. Now, the umbrella term for this technique is known as environmental storytelling, and it's fairly unique to games since it does require an amount of interactivity from the player for the context to be established in the first place. And to further build that connection, they usually keep things consistent by having the character and the player simultaneously witness events for the first time. Both Gone Home and the Half-Life series have excelled at this style, but it's done particularly well in Metroid Prime, thanks to the brilliant inclusion of the scan visor. Not only did it add an extra layer to solving puzzles through careful analysis of your surroundings, but it allowed you to scan any enemy, notable landmark, a piece of lore explaining the history of your environment. And the great thing about this is, suddenly this mysterious, isolated alien world could now be documented and understood, so the great big daunting task that was set out for you becomes approachable. And what's also great about this system is that it's in both Samus and the player's interest to scan as much as possible. Samus is an explorer, and keeping track of her discoveries in a logbook is fitting. But since the information is crucial to have me beat the game, I want to keep track of it too. Both her and the player are learning and growing stronger together. At the end of the game, when you untangle the complexities of the world and complete your mission, you both share the same sense of triumph. You beat a hard game, and Samus has the satisfaction of a job well done. It's all perfectly complementary, and it creates a powerful bond between player and character that makes the experience so potent. This naturally begs the question, how the hell did Other M screw this up?
I'm Samus Aran.
Giving Samus a voice was immediately controversial. Now, any major change to the status quo always attracts controversy, but this decision meant there would no longer be any ambiguity over what's going on in her head. Players have had over 2 decades of history with Samus, so they had great expectations on what she'd sound like. Now, it would have been impossible to satisfy everyone, but Samus's vocal debut managed to disappoint everyone. It's a pity too, because much of it comes from basic missteps in the execution. They rely so much on monotone monologues to express what she's feeling that they actually end up making renowned intergalactic bounty hunter Samus Aran boring. I don't even want to blame the voice actress because, apart from being directed to speak in that dry manner, the writing was so poorly localized and riddled with redundancies that I doubt any voice actor could have saved it.
I don't know how much time passed since then. Days went by in their quiet way, and people's recollections of Metroids and space pirates grew nebulous over time, relegated to a past concern of the galactic communities. Nothing more than a faded memory.
To be clear, it's not that there aren't moments where the use of monologues is appropriate. Many of the flashbacks have no dialogue, so there are key details that need to be explained. And the detached voice work does manage to give it a sense of distance, with it being in the past and all. The problem is that they keep doing this in areas where they shouldn't. Consider, for example, whenever Samus uncovers a new feature from the world and proceeds to thoroughly outline her entire thought process. Like I mentioned, Metroid was already able to convey this information through its environmental storytelling. And due to the game's design, the player is already interested in the mysterious and the new. Having Samus tirelessly drone on about it kills the intrigue. It's like getting to experience a movie firsthand versus having someone describe it to you. It's not the same. But for me, the most jarring uses of the monologue occur during any cutscene where other characters are present in the same room. It feels unnatural, and it just completely breaks the flow of the story. No one has an extremely wordy internal monologue detailing the complete history of whoever they're presently conversing with, because that requires a level of multitasking that humans aren't capable of. Meanwhile, having to cut back and forth from Samus's thoughts to current situation with no rhyme or reason just slogs everything out like a bad soap opera. I sympathize with the amount of information they needed to get across, but this is simply a failure of making the most use of your medium. They even went ahead and made Samus's visor change transparencies just to make her face more visible, but they never bothered to actually use it to provide, actual facial expressions to illustrate what she's feeling so she doesn't have to explain it every single time. It's even weirder because many of the cutscenes are very carefully directed and self-explanatory, so why not go all out with that and just cut out the unneeded narration entirely?
In fact, let's try that for the following scene and see if we can still understand what's going on just from the visuals. From the start of this scene, we can feel that Samus's colleagues don't take her seriously, which causes her to double down and follow her own path. But, since she's walking that path alone, she has few to help guide her in this grand, intimidating world. Without any words, we can understand all of the emotions that this scene is conveying.
That said, these are all fumbles in the storytelling. There's no shortage of games that struggle in this area, but the scorn Other M receives in particular seems to stem from the story itself. Now, believe it or not, I'm actually going to defend the story here from a few of the common critiques that I hear about it, okay? So, bear with me, here we go. In terms of the narrative, where Samus bumps into her old commanding officer and uncovers a conspiracy among his crew, I'd actually argue that her character doesn't suffer too much here. There may be story beats where she's overpowered and needs to be rescued by men, but the majority of the game still has her single-handedly kicking all kinds of alien ass. She may have moments of vulnerability, but needing occasional assistance does not make one a weaker character, and it certainly never made me doubt for her capability when she's able to press on and carry out her mission. I also don't buy that the story makes Samus too dependent on men. Dependency to me only becomes a problem when the character in question is so reliant on a particular person that without said person, he or she might as well not exist. And really, despite all of the deviations the game takes from the Metroid mold, they uphold the tradition of having Samus work solo, relying solely on her skills and wit to save the day. Hell, all the men Samus was allegedly dependent on effectively die near the end, so if she truly was helpless, she would never have survived to the end of the game. That said, there are notable story moments which are admittingly quite hard to defend, and let's talk about when Samus breaks down in front of Ridley. It's not that the idea of facing a monster from your past whose presence is so traumatizing that you're unable to fight them. That's not a bad idea, that's not bad on its own. The fact that her inaction leads to the apparent death of a friend not only forces Samus to redeem herself, but also adds another mental burden for her to carry. This is all good stuff. Really, honestly. But the problem is that this particular monster is Ridley. Sure, he's responsible for killing her parents when she was a child, and would no doubt have been a daunting figure at certain stages in her life. At this point, though, she's probably fought Ridley a half dozen times. Even with the clever reason for why he'd be back after being killed in Super Metroid, one can't help but think that she'd just be used to fighting him at this point. And plus, that bit about him killing her parents is something that only ever came up in the manga. None of the games mention it, and the only setup provided in Other M comes from the brief clip of Samus reverting to her 3-year-old self upon seeing him. It's frustrating because it's one of the few elements in the game that did need to be explained more clearly. Nonetheless, I don't think that this idea was unsalvageable. Suppose they took a different angle out of it. Like, let's look at Doctor Who, where, in spite of the Doctor defeating the Daleks time and time again, they still managed to terrify him whenever they re-emerged.
They survive. They always survive when I lose everything.
In this situation with Ridley, they could have played up the weariness Samus was feeling from having to face off with him so many times. Instead of being yet another big monster shoot, they could have made him more like a recurring demon, and would not only depict Samus more competently, but also not contradict the game's melancholic themes. Actually, yeah, let's talk about theme for a second here. Now, it doesn't take an especially deep reading to see the motif of Other M is based on motherhood and loss of a child. I mean, the game opens up with that encounter with Mother Brain, where the baby Metroid, seeing Samus as its mother, sacrifices itself to save her. After that, Samus receives a distress signal known as... Oh, you gotta be kidding me. The baby's cry aboard the battleship? Who calls it the battleship? Anyway. She eventually uncovers the source of the conflict came from a complex mother-daughter relationship between Madeline Bergman and MB. So yeah, if the incredibly obvious anagram of the title didn't tip it off, this isn't exactly a subtle game. That said, this thematic depiction of Samus was another area where people felt that Other M didn't do her character justice, and to some extent I can see why. One of the coolest things about Samus in the past was how the fact that she was a woman was completely incidental. Sure, it's more than possible that the initial twist just came from a bunch of guys wanting to reward predominantly male players with an eye-candy reward based on a completion time. Possible, yes, but really the implications it set up were far more interesting. The surprise that Samus this whole time had been a woman didn't invalidate everything she just did. It took the preconception that only men could accomplish these amazing feats and shattered them. They didn't need to make a big preachy deal out of it, they just showed an example of a gender role being turned on its head. Since her main claim to fame is effectively as a nonconformist, in that regard, to see them expand on her with these specific feminine themes does seem disingenuous and no doubt why many couldn't connect with her like before. But I would say the idea itself isn't harmful. I do think this particular theme is one that's been shamefully unexplored in games with regards to a playable female character. So, if nothing else, Other M does fill a hole in the medium. Not only that, it builds off the motif established in Metroid 2 and Super Metroid, so though maybe obvious and clunky, it is consistent. And, okay, so I know that was sort of a half defense, half critique, but at the same time, the whole point of this is that while I believe that Metroid Other M ruined the bond that was felt between player and character, I don't think that these were any of the reasons why. Games are not movies. I mean, duh, of course they're not, you know that. But what I mean by that is that while games have been around for decades, game criticism and discussion is still very much in its infancy. We're still sort of figuring out how to talk about them beyond analyzing objective elements like graphics quality, lasting appeal, and so forth. We've made strides, to be sure, in diving into elements like presentation, story, and theme from various critical lenses, but even that seems insufficient.
In Lindsay Ellis's ongoing series about Michael Bay's Transformers movies, she makes the recurring argument that the plot and the characters are often in conflict with the way the film is shot and edited.
The text says one thing, the camera says another, and because this is a visual medium, what the audience remembers is what the camera tells them. Michaela is talking about how people don't see her as anything but a pair of TNA, but all the while the camera is conveying to the audience that this is her value.
By the same token, with games being an interactive medium, I argue that the design of the gameplay itself overpowers how a player can react to the whole of the experience.
This is all to say that despite the fact that I don't think the derision directed at Other M's story is all justified, I'd be lying if I said that the game didn't make me feel disconnected from Samus as well. Though there are narrative reasons why I feel this way, they stem from some very poor decisions in the game design. So, with that said, let's talk about the most glaring, horrible, awful thing about Metroid Other M, item acquisition.
Samus, looks like I'm gonna need to ask for your cooperation on this mission, but I'm also gonna have to ask that you follow my commands. You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so.
Now, unlike the traditional method of finding and obtaining various power-ups one by one throughout the game, in this case you actually start off with all of them. But not really. You see, they only become unlocked one by one when you receive authorization from your commanding officer. This manages to suck on multiple levels, but since this decision was made such that there would be a plot-related reason for why her arsenal would be limited, we'll start there first. It's not that trying to come up with a more clever reason than Samus lost her power-ups again. Go find them. Okay, it's not a bad idea to try to do a little better than that, but the one that they picked has terrible implications. Now, I'm willing to accept that she, in a moment of weakness, and a desire to please someone she greatly respects, would allow Adam to have authorization of her weapons. The problem is after a certain point, it makes zero sense for her to continue following that order. Sure, some of her arsenal could be far too destructive, but not all of them. I can't imagine how the Varia suit, gravity suit, space jump, or grapple beam could pose a threat to anyone. That lapse in logic makes it all the more frustrating when Samus faces an obstacle that could have been easily handled via one of her arbitrarily restricted powers. It'd be as dumb as slamming a nail into place with your hand just because your boss didn't say you could use that conveniently located hammer. Who does that? Besides, we see clearly when she activates the space jump, and all subsequent powers after that she was more than capable of using her abilities, but chose not to. In fairness, at this point in the game, Samus starts losing her trust in Adam, so this is an appropriate time for her to start disobeying his orders.
Any objections, Adam?
But we've also played enough of the game at this point to realize his orders never made sense in the first place. He says your weapons can be dangerous, but there's never a moment where that assertion proves to be true. The ship never gets heavily damaged because of how you use your weapons, and most perilous scenarios could have been made less dangerous by using your weapons. It's not enough to just tell the player that there's a threat, they have to feel it. For counterpoint, let's look at Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. The first two Prime games told you that Phazon was a powerful but dangerous substance, and you get to see that in how it affects the enemies in the world around you. But in Corruption, they go further by letting you use Phazon in the new Hyper Mode. It lets you dish out heavy damage while draining your health tanks, and, if it's overused, it could kill you. So you get to feel the risk, which not only adds a new layer to the combat, but it also makes your encounters with the corrupted bounty hunters all the more disconcerting because they were once in the same situation as you. So yeah, Adam, his reason, it sucks. I mean, apart from posing a threat, the only reason I can think of for why it would be in the player's interest to limit their capabilities is because newer abilities would end up replacing older ones. That principle certainly doesn't apply here, since Metroid's traditionally stacked every item you get such that they're all immediately available at your disposal. In fact, Super Metroid actually lets you turn your powers on or off, and the only reason that did not become a series mainstay is that I doubt any player ever made use of it. I mean, why would you? Why would you make yourself less capable and powerful when the game's only getting more difficult and complex? This gap between what the character wants and what the player wants sadly helps fuel that aforementioned disconnect, and it kills the immersion. Okay, this may all seem hyperbolic, but the point is that when you change the context informing the traditional design, even if that design remains mostly unchanged, there are consequences. Traditionally, the Metroid formula included situations for which you were ill-equipped, forcing you to return to that area once you've acquired the needed gadget. It's a good technique to make sure the player will remember these key rooms that they'll need to revisit, but also to make sure they feel like they're getting progressively stronger, because now all of these tough hurdles from before can be dealt with easily. Other M maintains this design choice, but the new authorization context reframes it in such a way that it makes Samus seem incompetent. She's portrayed in flashbacks as being a bit headstrong, too willing to leap into danger, but never outright dumb. When she's confronted with any ability-related problem that can be solved simply by activating said ability, choosing to neglect that makes her look either stupidly loyal to Adam's arbitrary orders or just plain stupid. And because this is a recurring issue rather than a particular moment from the story, it's honestly where I think most of the claims about Samus being too dependent came from. These unfortunate implications could have been avoided too with just minor plot revisions. Suppose they made it explicitly clear that giving Adam authorization meant Samus couldn't reactivate her weapons even if she wanted to. That is, it would take Adam contacting Samus to re-implement anything. And then suppose there are specific periods where communication with Adam is blocked, perhaps during these intense moments when subjected to heavy gravity or too much heat. So, the only way to re-establish connection is to get to a certain safe area. Suddenly, she's no longer blindly following orders, but rather having to deal with the repercussions from the original plan. And admittingly, while this would all at least fix her apparent incompetence, the sheer badness of this authorization system still affects how the player and character grow together. Much like past Metroid titles, Other M has Samus unlock new abilities bit by bit so much more of the world becomes accessible and so you can tackle more obstacles. It seems similar, but the difference lies not with what you're being given, but how it's being given. In Other M, weapons typically become unlocked once you've gotten to a point where going forward is impossible unless Adam conveniently expands your current inventory.
The most efficient way through here should be delivering shoulder impacts with your speed booster, so I'm authorizing its use.
Unfortunately, since there's no way of knowing where or when you'll get stuck, or even be sure whether you're actually stuck or just lost, the authorizations seem to occur sporadically. And because this isn't a strictly linear game, you'll still see many doors and pathways that are currently inaccessible due to not having a certain power-up. Unless the game suddenly decides it's time to arbitrarily let you use super missiles, you just gotta keep moving on. It's all frustrating to be sure, but the core problem with the system is that it provides no sense of accomplishment that the other games excelled at. They wouldn't just give you the morph ball, you had to figure out how to get to it. They wouldn't just give you the Various suit, you had to defeat Kraid to get it. This follows for nearly every power-up in every Metroid game being either hidden or guarded by a boss, so each new item felt like a reward, because you earned it. Not only were you improving Samus's capabilities, but because the game kept throwing increasingly difficult hoops for you to jump through just to get said items, it felt like you were getting stronger with her. It's just another design decision that helped strengthen the bond between player and character. Other M, while it does have some item discovery via missiles and energy tanks and this one boss fight, it otherwise completely sidesteps this sensation because there's no build-up or feeling of achievement. Even worse, Adam often gives you your power-ups in moments of extreme peril, as if to send the message that you were incapable of winning until he gave you permission to use your better tools. This is like writing a test where, on the one hand, you have a tough problem that you eventually figure out how to do it on your own, versus one where you struggle for a bit, but then your teacher intervenes and effectively gives you the answer. The end result may be the same, but the latter's not nearly as rewarding, and it certainly doesn't feel like you're improving. And really, despite everything we talked about before, I feel that this is the defining one that makes Samus feel like a weak character in Other M. The fact that she, and you, by extension, don't grow stronger. Granted, it may seem weird to claim that she's somehow feeble now, even though this is the first game in the series where you can grab the tail of an enemy, swing it around, and slam it on the ground again.
Which begs the question, this looks awesome, why doesn't it feel awesome?
Given that Other M was co-developed by Team Ninja, this new hyper-stylized fighting isn't a surprising addition. It's still a bizarre idea to introduce in the series. Like I said, most enemies in Metroid can be dispensed of quite casually, and the challenge came from managing your health in the long term. The more intense fights came from bosses, but those were more tests of endurance and deduction. This doesn't exactly mesh with the traditional fighting game mold where the focus is more on reflexes and acquiring a mastery over your complex moveset with all the various combos and everything. That said, I don't think it's an inherently incompatible idea, and okay, I've always thought the idea of Samus shooting a charge shot point blank to a space pirate's face would be badass, and while Other M certainly delivers on that, the cool animations can't hide the fact that the combat has very little depth. Having an auto-aim certainly doesn't help, since apart from not always letting you shoot who you want to shoot, its lack of complexity generally means very little skill is required to destroy enemies. It's not even a matter of making the game too easy. This mechanic just doesn't ask enough input from the player. It makes each victory feel less satisfying than it should be. It's particularly odd because Metroid Prime 3 made full use of the Wii controller, and it allowed you to move and aim precisely simultaneously. By only providing that precision from a first-person perspective in which you are incapable of moving, it can't help but feel like a downgrade. I suppose this is meant to give the player more options in how they fight, but the sad thing is, it's one of the few times Samus's various moves complement each other at all. It's honestly quite astonishing that a game so clearly influenced by the fighter genre would have little to no combos. The sheer variety they offer can keep the combat fresh, due to the different circumstances in which they'll be tactically useful. Yet, in spite of Samus's many unique abilities, Other M's combat is limited to shooting, dodging, jumping, and that's about it. It just feels uncreative when you consider everything Samus is capable of. Imagine if she used the grappling hook to toss the enemies into other enemies, or pull them in close to get a finishing charge shot, or what if instead of stacking your beam, you could swap it so that you could perform beam combos? What if you could also knock down foes with the morph ball and ricochet off others like a pinball, deploying bombs upon each foe you collide with? There's just so many possibilities to play with here. But the game seems content with merely mixing a well-timed dodge to get a quick charge shot. That's it. Now, to give credit where it's due, it at least understands that there has to be some sort of risk-reward dynamic when it comes to dodging, but unlike something like Bayonetta, there's not much incentive to do so. Successfully pulling off Witch Time in Bayonetta not only granted you more time to kick ass and perform awesome combos, but it also helped you charge your magic meter, which allowed you to do even more damage when activated. Since getting through combat quickly with as few scratches as possible will better your score, which is also your currency by the way, there's a constant emphasis on trying to get through the game more with as much finesse as possible. Meanwhile, Other M's only reward for being a skilled fighter is letting you progress to the next section. So, if you had one strategy, like jumping away from enemies and firing, if that works well enough, there's never a reason to change it. Maybe if the gap between risk and reward is more like how they implemented missiles, this problem could have been avoided. Again, we gotta give credit where it's due. In the case of missiles, you're deploying something that is substantially more powerful that would also lock onto targets. But it's at the cost of being unable to move and more likely to get hit because you don't have a good perspective on what's around you. And this only gets heightened once you acquire super missiles and seeker missiles because even though they dish out more damage, they take even longer to fire. And as much as I don't like how there's no more health and ammo to find from enemies and the environment, the ability to restore both through your concentration ability does add a level of tension that forces you to carefully assess the battle dynamics when in peril. Okay, granted the way they implement it for missiles does effectively make the missile expansions useless. I mean, okay, it was already lame that they changed the increments from 5 missiles to 1, but since you'll tend not to fight more than 5 enemies at a time, and each one takes about 2 to 3 missiles to kill, you'll almost never need more than 20 per enemy encounter, and since you can refill those whenever you want, it doesn't take long before you reach a certain threshold where you'll always have more than enough missiles. But you know, even this is a bit flawed, because when you think about it, fights are so quick, and firing missiles is too time-consuming, so if you have a spare moment to fire one, you also have a spare moment to replenish them. This even extends to boss fights. Oh, they may look more imposing and they might take longer to beat, but apart from having more health, they don't substantially differ from every other fight in the game, where it's just shoot, dodge, rinse, repeat. I know Other M isn't exactly the only offender of this shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge, shoot, dodge. I know Other M isn't exactly the only offender of this simple game loop, but this series was always notable for requiring more creative solutions to boss fights. Consider one of the first fights in Metroid Prime against this floral monster here. Shooting and dodging, they were essential, but you also have to make use of the environment. You have to shoot down these mirrors, but as the fight progresses, you discover not only do you need to hit multiple mirrors, but the monster can swap them back after a while. So what we have to process while playing this section is how to manage your location in the room, your timing on when you can hit the mirrors, and in which order. all while being attacked by a great big lumbering monster. This can be a lot to take in, but that amount of mental activity makes boss fights all the more exciting, and it makes you feel awesome when you win. And like I've been saying, when the player feels awesome because they're getting better, we project that onto Samus getting stronger too. Okay, now even though I've spent the last few minutes talking about all the combat and her fighting, the truth is Samus has always been much more than a badass who shoots aliens. She has far more in common with Link than Master Chief in that she's primarily an adventurer. Samus travels to uncharted territories and navigates complex environments that many others simply wouldn't be capable of. Her job title may be Bounty Hunter, but I suspect that's more a convenient means of being able to explore and find meaning in the vastness of space, while also being able to make a living. Okay, that's purely speculative to be sure, but I do feel the fact that she was raised by the Chozo reinforces this idea. That ancient alien race had traveled and settled throughout the galaxy, and since they're all but extinct now, it provides her an incentive to seek out and continue their way of life in any way she can. Now, I'm not demanding that every planet Samus visits needs to have some form of culture and mythos reminiscent of the Chozo, but what's important is to have that spirit of adventure and discovery alive. Other M's sadly can't maintain that spirit, thanks in large part to how linear the game is. Okay, I get it. They had a specific story they wanted to tell, and linearity can go a long way to keep the structure and pacing intact. Designers need to have some idea whether the players will spend 10 minutes between story beats or 10 hours. That said, there's surprisingly few pertinent or ongoing objectives related to the plot in the game. Despite the occasional meetup or phone call with other characters, you're still mostly left on your own. Most major plot developments that do occur are self-contained in their respective cutscene, and only result with the need to explore further. The only time-sensitive moment, except for that part at the end, I even remember was when you had to chase down a Federation soldier. So really, there's no strong narrative reason to limit where the game would allow the player to go. So, allow me to calmly inquire, why the hell are there so many red doors? I want to explore this world. Why won't you let me? Having locked doors at certain points in the game is nothing new to Metroid, but they were impenetrable because you needed to figure out how to open it, be it with a certain item or by dispatching all local enemies. It put the onus on the player, and it meant that even when the current accessible region of the world was tiny, it never felt like the game was constricting you. You still had that agency. Meanwhile, Other M has so many arbitrarily locked doors that not only block off future locations, but places you've already been to. Worse still, there's no consistent rhyme or reason for why the game's doing this. It's not like certain chambers have been flooded with deadly radiation or have collapsed, okay, except for this one part, but still, they just keep them sealed off. When you're dealing with a game series that's built around the idea of exploration, these arbitrary constraints make it feel less like you're in a living, breathing world, and more like you're trapped in one long-ass hallway. And finally, what's even worse about it is there's no way to tell which part is currently inaccessible until you actually get there. It doesn't show up on the map. It shouldn't be that hard to make a decent map to ease your travels, but these oversights make hunting down expansions and such incredibly frustrating. There's a very real chance that you'll make a long journey to get to that little blip on your screen, only to find out that you actually can't get in the room right now. It's an enormous step backward when you consider what Metroid Prime offered. That map was in 3D, gave a proper sense of verticality and distance, let you know which rooms were still unchecked, color-coded the doors so you knew before making the journey where you may get stuck, and it was fully adjustable so you could zoom in and rotate and get the exact angle you needed. Okay, and yeah, I know, it sounds weird to spend so much time complaining about a map, but in a game series that's all about exploration, it's important to know where you've been and where you're going. Metroid Other M doesn't have that kind of dynamic system, and it's instead focused on relying on objective markers, which defeat the whole purpose of trying to make the player feel like an explorer. Okay, to be fair, these frustrating moments aren't a permanent issue. Points of no return are thankfully absent, and after the credits roll, you're free to go everywhere to uncover the secrets that you missed. It's just such a shame then that the actual layout of the world is so unremarkable. Instead of an expansive world that keeps you eager to discover how it all fits together, we get way too many long, narrow corridors to run up and down. Sure, they've been a staple of the series since the beginning, but they always served a specific purpose. They were used to connect more significant parts of the map with the destination more efficiently. Even the original Metroid was able to make full use of its 2 dimensions by designing branching pathways that took into account both height and width. Metroid Prime would go further by having giant rooms with multiple exits and elevators that spread out the scope of the world, but keep it linked. And really, despite how Other M's map might look like it's twisting and turning, the general lack of multiple doors per room, and the near complete separation of the 3 sectors, it basically means that you're going in a giant straight line that just loops back on itself. If all these bland corridors do is connect one big open room with merely 2 doors to another one just like it, it makes it all seem like a waste of space. This isn't a vast world, it's a goddamn Mobius strip. The few big open rooms that do exist are still hampered by the presence of invisible walls. I understand that these concessions prove necessary in most games, but Metroid in particular always encouraged you to vigorously explore your surroundings, to find hidden secrets and alternate trails. Having these barriers pop up time and time again severely dampens your curiosity in examining anything. You're likely to miss all of the little details that help establish the setting. Hell, in terms of world building, they actually make the invisible walls part of the premise, with the ship simulating different environments. They literally provide an illusion of a varied, interesting world without actually having one. And really, even if they were technically real, these are still some of the most cliché and blandly designed locales in the series' history. Metroid's about exploring alien, unfamiliar worlds. It requires greater creativity than dishing out the overused ice world, fire world, plant world, or the boring spaceship where we actually are. When those generic themes were used in past titles, they at least had some identity thanks to their accompanying music, the unique enemies, or the lore of the place. It gave those areas some context that could allow you to lose yourself in the atmosphere.
And while Other M has some atmospheric music, you'll rarely hear it, as it's often drowned out by the frequent kinetic combat. As for the enemies, despite the variations, there's basically 2 types. Ones that mind their own business, and then the ones that get up in your face to fight. The former die so quickly you barely notice them, while the latter jump around so much that you can't appreciate their visual design either. Finally, the specific lore for each part of the world is essentially the following. You're on a spaceship that's simulating more diverse environments, but anything interesting you might see off in the distance is just an illusion. It's all fake.
Hell, the areas don't even have names. They're just incrementally numbered sectors. At the end of the day, Other M just doesn't contribute anything unique or interesting to the series for the player to discover. Which begs the question, why should we play it in the first place? Well, despite going on for however many minutes at why I think this game fails at making you feel like the badass explorer we know and love, I actually don't hate this game. Clunky storytelling and all, it still kept me engaged to see through to the end. Okay, that may seem like damning with faint praise, but we live in an age where it's actually not that common for people to finish their games, so the fact that Other M never lost my interest is honestly more than I can say for many AAA titles. And to be clear, my engagement wasn't born from just witnessing a disaster that I couldn't stop staring at. And the reason is, I genuinely believe that the story absolutely nailed one of the most important aspects that defines Samus Aran: loneliness. It may seem counterintuitive to claim that, since this game probably has more people interacting with Samus than ever before. Even the regular grunt soldiers get established early on with names and faint hints of personality. This is temporary though, as much of the gameplay has no one else around, and those characters each get picked off one by one. It can't help but communicate that Samus's time with others is short-lived, and that she'll inevitably default to her lonely state of being. I said earlier that Samus was compelling because she could still succeed in spite of her solitude, but here we get to see exactly how much of a mental toll this has taken. This mindset, coupled with reuniting with an influential figure like Adam Malkovich, leads her to do some foolish things, like joining a Federation mission or giving him complete authorization of her weapons. Anyway, many have dismissed this as her just trying to please a man. And while I'm not saying that's not in there at all, I see it more as Samus trying to shed her lonesome state of being and to try to be part of a group.
That information is not for an outsider.
The word he so obviously chose, outsider, pierced my heart.
See, as melodramatic as that line was, I have no problem believing that her being referred to as an outsider destroys her, especially when it comes from someone she greatly respects. But that sense of community dissipates, not just due to its members dying, but the fact that one of them is picking off the other ones as the deleter. That, compounded with the revelation of the Federation's role of the bottle ship, erodes Samus's sense of trust in other people. Hell, the only moments where she does regain that trust, for Anthony and Adam respectively, is immediately followed with those characters nobly sacrificing themselves. Really, the game's events seem to reinforce precisely why Samus would prefer working alone. Her attachments with others inevitably break, and that loss crushes her more than if they were never there in the first place. In any case, this emotional whiplash leaves Samus in the most vulnerable mental state she's ever been in. Now, this vulnerability does admittedly make playing this version of Samus less fun, but at least that element was tightly interwoven with the plot. It's no coincidence that the game opens with a cutscene of the iconic moment where Samus is saved by the baby Metroid from Mother Brain. Recall that in the original SNES game, the climactic showdown is expressed almost entirely through gameplay. It starts off like every other boss fight, but it then leads to a moment where you repeatedly get struck by an unavoidable laser. No matter how much damage you dish out, or how well you've been dodging her attacks, this moment is unwinnable. Before, Samus only ever showed weakness when the player was doing poorly, but this moment was specifically designed to make you both feel helpless. This was a serious milestone in her life. It's the first time where she's been completely stripped of her agency and is facing mortal consequences for it. Given that it's a recurring thread in Other M that she requires extra help in some battles, it's clear that she's still rattled by that event. And if any of that seemed familiar, it's because it's basically what Legend of Korra did. And not only was no one complaining about it, most people thought it made the show better. Korra, like Samus, basically started off as a badass.
You gotta deal with it!
And was honestly hard to care about because she never changed or learned anything. But by having her substantially lose something, they were able to set up an actual character arc. And like they did it with Korra, they did it with Samus. In games, you can get away with the hero just being a badass if they're solely meant to be an extension for the player. But given the emphasis Other M had on story, she would have been profoundly uninteresting if she had no flaws or underwent no emotional development. Incidentally, many who clamor for more feminist characters tout these very issues as crucial character traits. Now, on that note, I'm far from an expert on feminism, but I legitimately think one can interpret Other M as being critical of patriarchy. Samus does submit herself to a father figure and his squad of men at the beginning, yet the rest of the game seems hell-bent on illustrating why this was a terrible idea. Following Adam's orders just made her less capable, and made her more prone to danger. The mostly unknown squadron turns out to have a traitor among them who is trying to kill all of them, including you. And then you have the seemingly male-dominated Federation itself, which was blinded by power by trying to clone Metroids. Spoiler alert, this was a terrible idea. Why did you do that? Stop cloning Metroid! At the same time, consider the three female characters, Samus, Madeline Bergman, and MB. Samus is normally detached from the system, but she submits herself to it here, and only uncovers more reasons why she should keep separate from it in the first place. Madeline Bergman, meanwhile, is trapped in the system, and her compassion and non-violent attempts to deal with the MB situation are met with acts of domination and violence from the Federation.
Stop! What are you doing to her?
These orders are from above. Take her away.
Effie!
Madeline!
She reached out to me and asked
Calm
me
down.
for help, but there was nothing I could do.
Finally, MB is a victim from the system, as the very emergence of her agency is deemed by the Federation as threatening, and her attempts to defend herself were met with more hostility. To put the nail on the head, when these three characters are together, it's implied that the conflict could have been resolved peacefully were it not for all those army guys arriving and messing it all up. Again. As for the patriarchal figure, Adam Malkovich himself, though he's not a particularly interesting character, he does provide some interesting parallels to Samus herself. Adam limits what he's capable of because of his rules and affiliations. Samus doesn't like these rules, hence why she's a bounty hunter, and she's glad to be rid of them. But she also fails to realize her own limits. Given those different value systems and his cold and distant attitude towards her at the beginning, it may seem odd that she would go to such lengths to do his bidding.
I didn't need to press Adam about it any further. I knew his mind. Not only was he a strong opponent of bioweapons, he was against the use of living things for unnecessary reasons, period.
Samus's monologues certainly outline in great deal why she respects him, but it's ultimately the only perspective we get on him. Fortunately, he's redeemed thanks to two scenes in the game. The first is when he chooses to sacrifice himself via self-destructing Sector Zero. Now, I'm not saying the scenario made sense. I mean, despite the apparent threat of unfreezable Metroids, Samus has accomplished such great feats that I have a hard time believing she couldn't find a way to handle that too.
Then again, none of this makes sense.
What's important, though, is it showed Adam's willingness to do whatever it takes to complete the mission wasn't just talk, and he was prepared to lay his own life on the line. It also showed how he would not willingly put other people's lives ahead of his own by sending them to their certain doom. That is indeed a trait worth admiring in a leader, and certainly one worth following. The second scene is one that you might not have seen because it's the post-credits ending of the game, which, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna say it. I think it's flat out brilliant. The flashback where Adam realizes what MB is plotting shows very genuine concern for Samus's safety, and is also the first and only time in which he breaks his robotic tone of voice.
No! Samus!
Even when his brother was about to die, Adam never lost his cool, so this being the singular moment that prompts a desperate reaction from him speaks volumes about what Samus meant to him. This moment also doubles as a means to illustrate what Adam meant to her. The cutscene where they revealed that the irreplaceable item that she went back for was just his helmet, it's stellar in its simplicity. It may look like literally every other one worn by the soldiers, but it means something more to Samus. It's the last remaining belonging she has from not just a father figure and a mentor, but a friend, one of the few she had left. And for all of the monologues where Samus drones on about every single thought she's had, there is not one word spoken by her here. She hugs his helmet in silence as if to say, this is something she has to feel alone, even from the player. It's extremely effective, and though I wish the game had more silent moments like this, it might have cheapened the poignancy of this particular moment. After escaping to her ship from the always classic timed self-destruct sequence, well, you know what, I'll let her speak for herself.
Sorry for keeping you waiting, Adam. Let's go home.
Other M forces Samus through an ordeal that tests both her physicality and emotional level. Yet, with the resolve on display here, I feel like she's made progress in both areas that will better inform her in the future. In spite of all odds, Samus has grown stronger. And honestly, these elements, as well as the nature of some other aspects of the game design, it does mean Other M is a game that gets better the further it gets along, and I'd argue it offers more upon reflection than I think many give it credit for. It's not Nintendo's best work, far from it, and I don't think it's a great direction for the Metroid series, but it does have a place in video game history beyond being seen as some grand betrayal.
I had to scrap my original ending for this piece. It was written when Metroid Prime Federation Force had just been announced and got people upset all over again. Fans even petitioned Nintendo to cancel the game mere months before its release. I hadn't played it, and I thought that petition was insulting to all the talented devs at Next Level Games. But I must confess I was just as livid at that announcement. That initial conclusion was basically just me joining in the chorus of hate at the very idea of a co-op, Samus-less Metroid title. And honestly, it made me believe that our indignant reaction to Other M may have pushed Nintendo away from making core Metroid titles, and this is all we'd get from now on. But oh, how times change. while I've been editing all of this together, not only did that title come and go, but at E3 2017, Nintendo revealed the long-requested remake for Metroid 2 for the 3DS, as well as a teaser for Metroid Prime 4 on the Switch. That 3DS title fared pretty well with critics and seemed to sell decently, and though we know next to nothing about Prime 4, the mere fact that it exists seems to indicate that Nintendo is listening to its fans. Hell, even in the upcoming Smash Bros., they finally had Ridley and Dark Samus join the fight after much outcry. It would all appear that now is as good a time as any to get into Metroid. But as hopeful as I am for Prime 4, I'm worried. Not just because Retro Studios isn't involved, and nor that the game hasn't even been mentioned since its reveal. Rather, I worry about how we got here. Metroid Other M did not live up to fans' expectations, and that was certainly disappointing. But in the age of the internet, we've gone from simply being disappointed to feeling betrayed and expressing hate and rage on truly staggering levels. One need not look further than to look at all the YouTube videos hating on The Last Jedi, No Man's Sky, Teen Titans Go, to name a few. And I'm just gonna say it. It's not healthy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you have to like Other M, or any of the works mentioned above, nor am I saying you shouldn't be critical or passionate about these. I mean, I just spent an hour breaking down every facet of this one game that I could think of. That being said, I made this because I felt there were more complex reasons we reacted to Other M, other than, oh, Samus shouldn't talk, or the story, bad. And by all means, hash it out in the comments if you disagree with anything I said. But all I ask is that when we look back on what may have let us down, we step back from the hate we may feel, because while hate may be genuine and it might be really cathartic, it can also be all-consuming, and it can cloud over the stuff that you might like, or at least something that you might think is worth talking about. I hope Prime 4 is being made out of a desire to explore the possibilities of this great franchise, and not just to pander to fans. I hope they learn from where Other M fell short, but also look at some of the risks that it took that might be worth pursuing further. And I hope that we as a fan base don't dismiss that. And in the end, I hope we can take a lesson from the great bounty hunter herself, who doesn't just solve her problems by blowing them up, but by examining the details. Figure out path forward from there. Hello all, thank you so much for watching this. This is a project I've been wanting to do for a while now. I thank you for indulging me if you actually managed to get this far. I've been working on and off for this for a few years, and I'm obviously an amateur, so I apologize about any of the sound issues. I couldn't re-record everything. I did the best with what I had. This is also my first video essay. I'm not really aware of the protocol. I didn't have it on me to capture much footage, so I borrowed a lot from it from YouTubers, so I'm trying to list as much of it as I can in the credits from memory. I apologize if I left anything out. I also used some DeviantArt photos, and I want to give as much credit to those as possible because some of it was really good, but it's also a bit hard to figure out who was the original artist, so I hope I got it all right, but who knows. I also want to thank some people who I've been watching for a good long while who, I don't know them, but they definitely influenced how I wanted to go about making this. One is obviously Lindsay Ellis. I cited her in the piece earlier, and I've been watching her for years, and it's just a thrill because I thought she was always good, and she's just gotten better and better and better, and now she's on a level in the video essay game that is really hard to top, so, you know, she's awesome. I hope she keeps doing what she's doing. The other one is Ego Raptor, or Aaron Hansen of Game Grumps. I know he's only done about 3 or 4 of these episodes, but his Sequelitis videos are some of the best game design breakdown videos I've seen. I wish he'd make more, but, you know, I get it. Also H Bomber Guy. I haven't watched a ton of his videos, but the fact that he can make hour-long videos about one topic is kind of what made me feel like, okay, maybe I could do this too. Who knows? And yeah, that is a shout out to him in one of the titles in the, what was it, part 4? Yeah, or part 3 was it? Anyway. I also want to give a shout out to Extra Credits, just because this video that they made quite a while ago did serve as sort of a jumping off point for myself, so I do want to thank them for that. And just as a side note, I didn't intentionally try to copy what anybody else may have already said about Other M. I didn't watch any other video essays since I started working on this, so if I did say anything that aligns with somebody else, I apologize. I wasn't intentional. What can you do? And finally, I want to give a shout out to Mark Brown at Game Maker's Toolkit. I think he's been putting out some of the best game design videos out there. They're really well produced. They're really informative. And also the fact that he's doing a second season of Boss Keys where he's analyzing all the Metroid games. That's kind of what gave me the impetus to finally finish this. Anyway, that's about it. I don't really have announcements about the future. I just really kind of want to get this one thing done and go from there. If you get enough interest and enough comments, I might do a response video. Who knows? I might also have other projects in the pipeline, but we'll see. All right, thank you. Take care.